Hello, welcome to my review of Mega Man X4. This game was originally released in 1997 for the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. I played the Legacy Collection version that was released in 2018. For me, from the very beginning of the X series, there's been this tension, this kind of elephant in the room, and I think it's that Zero really is meant to be the main character, the one that is really the more dramatic and interesting character of the series. It's kind of like Vegeta in Dragon Ball Z or Han Solo in the original Star Wars. Though they're not the main character, they're often the one that is a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more intense, and a little bit more interesting in a lot of situations. Whereas X, kind of like Luke Skywalker or Goku, is a little bit more predictable. So it's been kind of interesting to go through the series to this point and kind of really wonder what's going to happen with Zero. And not just from a storyline standpoint, but from a gameplay standpoint. Aside from Mega Man 10, character selection hasn't really been a prominent feature of the Mega Man series. So it is very interesting to start up Mega Man X4 and see that there's a character selection option right from the very beginning. So with all that being said, in this review there's going to be major spoilers for Mega Man X4 and the previous X games, so if you don't want the storyline spoiled, you might want to get out of this review right now. And then we're also going to really explore the gameplay and the context of Mega Man X4, and just see how it all comes together and see if this is another great entry in the series, or if it's disappointing and if it doesn't all add up to something awesome. So with all that being said, let's explore the context in which Mega Man X4 exists, both historically when it came out and now in our modern gaming landscape. When you look at the historical context of Mega Man X4's release, you see that it's really in a unique place within the Mega Man series, and really it's in a unique place for any sequel in any series to be. You could argue that the Mega Man franchise was oversaturated almost from the beginning. I've reviewed all the classic Mega Man games, the X series up to this point, and even both of the arcade games. And while I think that they're all good games, you can't deny the numbers. Mega Man 1 came out in 1987, and by the time X4 was released in 1997, the franchise had released 8 classic series games, 3 X games, 2 arcade games, 5 Game Boy games, a soccer game, 2 PC games that are their own games, and outside of North America, there was a kart racing game and a virtual board game. And I'm sure someone in the comments is going to let me know of a game that I'm missing here. The point is that depending on how you count, that's about 20 games in 10 years. This is on par with like a sports franchise games like Madden that come out every year. There was a lot of Mega Man by the time Mega Man X4 was released. Also, equally as important to understanding the context of X4's release is the shift the gaming industry was going through. 3D was becoming much more mainstream. Mario 64 had revolutionized 3D platforming a year before X's release, and many other franchises would be making their own attempt at 3D over the next few years, including Mega Man. In June of 1997, a few months before X4's August release date, Capcom had shown the world the upcoming 3D Mega Man game that would come to be known as Mega Man Legends. So when you consider that there were 20 Mega Man releases up to this point, and there was a new big 3D Mega Man game really just around the corner, it's not hard to see why Mega Man X4 wasn't a big cultural event like Mega Man 2 and Mega Man X were. Now, the industry was shifting generally towards 3D at the time of Mega Man X4's release, but that's not to say that there weren't any 2D sprite-based games coming out. I think the biggest reason X4 got somewhat ignored at the time of its release was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. That game came out the same year on the same console 3 months earlier, so players looking for a new 2D action game may have felt satisfied or preoccupied with Symphony of the Night. X4 is kind of like the Houston Rockets in the 90s. They were a basketball dynasty that won 2 back-to-back championships, and they had some all-time great players on their team. But they're kind of somewhat ignored because the Bulls also were a great 90s basketball dynasty that just cast such a large shadow. There was a lot of large shadows covering Mega Man X4, whether it be the somewhat oversaturated series up to that point, the looming release of Mega Man Legends, or the just released Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And also, I've got to mention Mega Man 8, which came out the same year and is a stunningly beautiful game. So that game's release may have distracted some people from Mega Man X4 as well. Now, in our modern gaming landscape, Mega Man X4 is kind of in an interesting place. I feel like growing up, people didn't mention it much, at least not in the circles that I was gaming with. And I think on YouTube and stuff like that, I haven't seen much coverage of it over the years. But that seems to be starting to change. I've noticed more and more people mention it, more and more reviews of Mega Man X4 seem to pop up. And I think that now people are generally coming to regard the game as kind of a hidden gem, which is cool. I'm always excited when the Mega Man series gets a little bit more of a spotlight put on it. Now, with that being said, let's look at the storyline of Mega Man X4 and see how it adds to the gameplay. The storyline in X4 overall is great, and it's a big reason of why the game is so much fun to play. At the start of the game, you pick between X and Zero, and both characters' storylines are significantly different. The story in X4 is a much darker storyline than what I've seen in the previous Mega Man games, or really any Mega Man game that I've reviewed. There are multiple betrayals and character deaths that make the conflict seem much more heavy and much more dire than ever before. And the conclusion of the game ultimately leaves things kind of ambiguous and sad, and you really feel like the bad guys are really evil and manipulative. And so it's just, again, a really intense, dark, tragic storyline. It also feels like a classic 90s shonen anime. I've mentioned before the comparisons between Vegeta and Goku and Mega Man and X, and I think that's kind of a classic shonen archetype or trope. There's often duos of characters in these shonen series, and the two duo characters often have a special sense of drama and tension between them. I think of, again, Goku and Vegeta, but also Gon and Killua, or Naruto and Sasuke, just to name a few classic shonen duos. These tense friendships are so interesting because you're not really sure if they're gonna be each other's best friend for life or murder each other. And it's a great example of shonen storytelling, and it's really what Mega Man X is going for between X and Zero. And spoilers for X3, at the end of that game, you get the bombshell that X is going to have to eventually defeat Zero. So it's just really interesting to kind of see how this plays out. There's even, in X1, the sacrifice that Zero dies to protect X, kind of similar to early in Naruto, where Sasuke, again, spoilers, sacrifices himself to save Naruto, even though Sasuke doesn't die. But again, I just see that classic shonen storytelling inside of the Mega Man X storyline, and especially in X4. At the beginning of the game, there's an attack on a major city, and the game clearly tells us that innocent people are killed. And the Maverick Hunters suspect another group of robots called the Repliforce to be responsible for the attack. And the leaders of the Repliforce, the Colonel and the General, they know that they're innocent, and they choose that on principle they're going to fight against the Maverick Hunters rather than just simply submit their rights over to them. It's much more political and tragic because you kind of know that the Repliforce is not responsible for this attack. The game makes it pretty clear, but at the same time the Maverick Hunters are in a hard situation because they need to figure out who did it, and the Repliforce is very prideful and strong-willed, and so it's a very tense story right from the beginning. And again, with the deaths of people in the cities, it feels very high stakes. There are subtle different interactions for both Zero and X as you play through the game that really add a sense of life to the world. Notably, Magma Dragoon laughs and says that he betrayed the Maverick Hunters just for a chance to fight X. But then when you're playing as Zero, he says that he regrets that he has to fight Zero. It's kind of interesting that you see that characters maybe respect Zero more than X. There's also a point where X pleads with a member of the Repliforce to turn back from the war, and that the Repliforce is making a mistake. But then there's a time when Zero tells another character just to shut up and fight. So again, X is maybe a little bit more soft and a little bit more willing to negotiate things, whereas Zero seems a little bit more powerful and stoic and prepared to fight. In X's storyline, he's betrayed by the character Double, which is kind of a surprising betrayal because Double just looks like such a goofy character. And then in Zero's storyline, Zero has a character named Iris that's with him, and her brother is the Colonel of the Repliforce, and ultimately he pushes her too far in the conflict, and she chooses to fight Zero, which is almost Shakespearean. It's really sad. For fans of the franchise, I'm sure that it'll be no surprise that Sigma is the true villain of the game. The game makes little effort to hide this. Sigma is more creepy and almost like a dark evil wizard in this one. He wears a cloak and at one point even looks like the Grim Reaper, and then at the end he mutates into this giant grotesque face and is just overall a really intense form of evil. But what's most different about Sigma this time is that his backstory is somewhat revealed. You learn that he encountered Zero when Zero was still a Maverick, and they fought, which is a major bombshell for the storyline. And the imagery is very subtle, but it's clear that there's a W on Zero's forehead, and when it's broken by Sigma, something's transferred between the two of them, and Sigma becomes evil from then on. Now, the game makes it pretty clear that the W is a reference to Dr. Wily. There's a part where Zero has a flashback to when he's in like a test tube being built, and he sees a silhouette of a character that's clearly Wily outside looking in on him, which is really cool how this game is tying itself to the classic series. Now, if you've played the arcade games, you may have seen the ending in which Dr. Wily kind of reveals that he's building a character that's going to help him defeat Mega Man, and that silhouette is clearly Zero, so everything's kind of coming together. I wonder what it would have been like to be a player back in the day and see all this come together. It's a cool storyline, and again, the game doesn't just shove it down your throat. If you hadn't played the classic series, you might wonder, who is this mysterious character? What does this W mean? And it's kind of cool that they don't just have a big lore dump and just tell you what's going on. You kind of connect the dots yourself, and it makes it really fun. Even though there's somewhat rough production value to the anime cutscenes, there's a part where Zero yells, "What am I fighting for?" And while, yeah, it's kind of goofy, I found it to be tragic. You see this character who, from the very beginning, was built to be evil, and this really complex, sad situation where characters are dying and killing each other and betraying each other. And you really wonder the same thing with Zero. What is he fighting for? What is ultimately going to happen? And again, it just makes everyone seem very confused and desperate, and it just adds to that dark heaviness of this chapter of the Mega Man series. And overall, I liked it. It never gets to the point where it's like needlessly edgy or extreme or anything like that. It's just an intense, dark game about a little bit of political drama, some character drama, and then mystery of these characters' destiny kind of comes into things and just, again, makes it feel dark and heavy, but in a way that I liked. It felt like it wouldn't have been too out of place if it was a cartoon show on Toonami in the 90s. Now I'm going to get into the most important part of the game, and that's the gameplay. But before I do want to mention that if you want to support the channel, there's a link in the description to my Steam page. I am making a game called Ogre Man. It combines my favorite game franchise, Mega Man, with a little bit of my favorite movie franchise, Shrek, to make a legally distinct original game. And I think that if you like action, 2D platformers, and if you like a little bit of sense of humor in your retro games, I think I'm going to make a game that a lot of people will like. So if you want to support the channel, please click the link in the description to my Steam page and wishlist Ogre Man. It would mean the world to me. And now back to the gameplay of Mega Man X4. As I've previously mentioned, from the very beginning, you can pick 0 or X. When you pick one, you are locked into playing as that character for the whole game. And they're both substantially different characters to use. Now, as I've talked about the storyline, you'd be forgiven in assuming that X is a somewhat neglected character in this game, but in terms of pure gameplay, that isn't the truth. X is completely different and very fun to use in this game. He starts out similar to previous games. He has a charge shot and a dash, but X has a full set of weapons and upgrades that are unique to him. Some of the weapon power-ups in this game are very unique within the series, like the ability to shoot fire straight up or shoot attacks that follow along the ground, or this flashy lock-on attack that almost looks like a clock going around X. X also has really unique and cool armor abilities in this game, and they're super useful, particularly the ability to hover in the air. All of this combines to make X feel more powerful in this game than any other Mega Man X game. By the time you get to the end of a playthrough with X, he just feels like this superhero with all these different abilities and all these different ways to attack the enemies. He is a very cool character to play through the game as, and if you've liked playing the Mega Man X series to this point, just playing as X alone in this game is a good playthrough. Now, 0 is almost completely different. Unlike X, he starts out with a sword that works as a melee attack, and it just completely changes how you approach the combat. He needs to get close to enemies, and so dashing and jumping around the levels becomes a must if you don't want to take a ton of damage. Things get really different with Zero as you beat the bosses. He doesn't get weapons like X, but instead he gets different sword attacks like a spinning air attack or a charge forward strike, and a really cool kind of upward Shoryuken style attack. Many of Zero's attacks can lead into each other, and as you learn the attacks and learn how to move quickly through the levels, you can really just thrash a lot of the enemies. Zero being red and having this melee style attack that almost kind of combos into other moves really reminded me actually of Dante from Devil May Cry. I actually, as I played this, wondered how much this game may have influenced Devil May Cry, because they're both made by Capcom and it's red characters that can kind of combo and stylistically fight each other. So yeah, that's an interesting connection, at least that I made. Both styles are very different and very fun, and this was a bold decision on the gameplay front to make two characters that play basically very different from each other. The designers really committed to making both characters feel complete. Neither feels half-baked, both feel that a lot of thought was put into their design and their playthrough. Personally, after reviewing the entire Classic series and the first 3 X games, I had more fun playing as Zero, but the X campaign is still great. Like previous games, X4 balances most of its moment-to-moment gameplay between combat and platforming, and both combat and platforming are excellent in this game. Each level has at least one, but sometimes multiple unique gimmicks, whether it be various types of destructible terrain in the ice level, or like the classic train level where you're destroying parts of the level as you go through it, or the falling lava balls in the volcano level. The game does a good job of constantly keeping things dynamic and interesting. My particular favorite was the mini levels in Cyber Peacock's stage. The level is divided into smaller sections, and the first 3 sections of the level will give you a grade from B to S. And it depends on how fast you get through the level and how quickly you get through that chunk. And if you get an S grade for that chunk of the level, you'll get a reward. And again, that's another comparison to Devil May Cry, because Devil May Cry has a grading system with S being the best. And so it's a cool idea, and it's kind of foreshadowing what Capcom might come out with next. Playing through those chunks as Zero, again, just really reminded me of Devil May Cry. And it's just super unique. I wish that they had used this grading system more in this game, because I think that it's a really cool system. It's very hard to get S on each section of the level, and there are even multiple routes through one of the sections. Newer players can just ignore the grades, but longtime Mega Man fans will probably love the extra challenge. Speaking of challenge, the game is generally pretty difficult. I would say it's harder than X1 and X2, but X3, especially at the end, is probably a little bit trickier than X4. But again, it's a more challenging Mega Man game, and I appreciated that. As with every Mega Man game, there are many boss fights in this game, and overall they're excellent here. I particularly want to highlight Magma Dragoon. This fight is brutal. He mimics some of Sagat's moves from Street Fighter. He has many different ways of attacking and countering your attacks as you're fighting against him, and different patterns. He really knows how to mix things up while you're fighting him. And it really feels like a fighting game, and it also feels fair. I was eventually able to beat him with X's basic attack, which was really exciting and cool. Now, to add an extra layer of awesome to this particular fight, you can sneak into the battle arena with a walking armor by walking through the lava, and you'll get a little bit of an advantage early in the fight if you do it this way. It's a little touch that makes an already awesome fight just go to the next level. It's one of my favorite fights really in any Mega Man game up to this point. X4's boss fights seem to be full of these extra little touches. Another example of this is in Jet Stingray's level. You'll see him flying over you as you go through the level, and you'll get chances to kind of shoot at him and maybe do a little bit of damage. And the Colonel is another great fight in the game. Like Magma Dragoon's encounter, his feels like just facing a skilled opponent in a fighting game. It feels fair but intense, and just like this really dramatic one-on-one fight. The final fight with Sigma, I think, is another classic. He has multiple phases and he's very challenging, and then it ends with his face being this giant grotesque abomination with wires coming out of it. Overall, it's a great batch of boss fights. It's also worth noting that the boss weaknesses don't seem to be quite as effective in X4. There's a couple moments where using the right weapon against a boss will just kind of take him out, but in general, I felt that even with the right weapon, there was more challenge in this game. Maybe I'm missing something, but I really rarely felt like I just had a trump card against any of the bosses. I also do want to mention that the E-tanks and the power-ups, again, don't seem to give you a super advantage in this game. I found them and used them, but in previous Mega Man games, if you have the right weapon and you have some fully charged E-tanks, you kind of feel unstoppable, but in this game, I felt like there was always a good chance I was going to die. There are a couple shortcomings though in the gameplay department for Mega Man X4 that I really do want to mention. Jet Stingray's level is mostly a rail section where you're riding on one of those hover bikes, and it's a pretty bad rail section, I would say. I would compare it to what I encountered in Mega Man 8. It's not as big of a problem as what was encountered in Mega Man 8 because it's shorter and it's the only notable rail section in the game. But again, it's basically a whole level, and it's just not particularly fun. I also want to mention the big elephant in the room, and that's being that you're going to be playing through all the same levels twice if you play through the game as X and as Zero. Now, they did make some tweaks to the level design that are notable in X4, I think, to counter this. The biggest tweak is that exploration has been basically taken out of the game. There's not really any significant secrets that I found. Nothing was really well hidden or required much exploration to find. There's even a point in a level where you kind of just fall down a waterfall and go to the right, and there's a Wily capsule right there. And then if you do it as Zero, you go in there and there's nothing. And it's interesting. I understand why they did this. Eliminating the exploration makes the game a lot less tedious in multiple playthroughs, but at the same time, the explorations kind of become a part of the sauce that makes Mega Man compelling, at least in my opinion. It's not quite a Metroidvania series, but exploration is a big part of the series that I really like, and so it's kind of disappointing to see that taken out of the game. There's just a general sense of risk to both Mega Man X4 and Mega Man 8. They took a lot of risks with both of these games, and in X4 they pay off much more than they did in Mega Man 8. And I wonder what the design room looked like for this game and all the different ideas they threw around. It's easy for me to be an armchair game designer, and I don't mean this in any kind of disrespectful way to the people who made the game, because ultimately X4 is a great game, and the big risk to make both X and Zero fully playable does pay off. They're both very fun to play as, but I think actually they could have done things differently and kept the exploration elements in the game. What I would have done, again, playing armchair game designer, was allow players to switch between X and Zero at the level select, and then incorporate more of that grading system found in Cyber Peacock's level into the game. So players who are completionists who really want to go for it can play through each part of the game as both X and Zero, maybe getting a grade at the end of the level or at certain checkpoints in the level, whereas players who want to just kind of play through the game in a more traditional route could just pick a character that fits their style at any given moment and go through the level that way. And then keeping the exploration elements in the game wouldn't have felt as tedious because you wouldn't have been forcing the casual players to play through the same levels twice. But again, that's me being an armchair game designer. Overall, the gameplay in this game, it's really good. I think it's an excellent game. I just do got to mention, that rail section. I don't like those bad rail sections from Mega Man 8, and I just got a flashback to it when I played that level in X4. And again, the tedium of playing through the same levels twice is frustrating, and there are some notable shortcomings, like when you go into that empty room as Zero and you just see that they just basically completely eliminated the exploration in a way that's kind of disappointing. But again, overall, the gameplay in this game I think is awesome. Now let's talk about the presentation of Mega Man X4, the way the game looks and the way the game sounds. Now, immediately when you look at the game, especially if you've played Mega Man X 1, 2, and 3, you'll notice that it is a major graphical leap from the Super Nintendo games. And overall, the game does look good. I really want to praise some of the animation, particularly Zero's hair and Slash Beast's animation. There's a lot of little just animated moments in this game that just look really crisp and clean and good, and again, it's a step up of what you could have done on the previous generation of consoles. There's also just a lot of cool vibrant colors in the game, like the level that has the waterfall or the beginning of the game where you're in the city. There's moments in this game that look great, and overall, like, Mega Man X4 is a good looking game. That being said, there are some real shortcomings to the visual presentation of this game, particularly in some of the pre-rendered graphics. There's a couple levels where you see pre-rendered ships in the background, and they're not animated at all. They look really stilted, just sliding through the background. At the end of the game, you have these pre-rendered robot heads that are kind of shiny and look really out of place and are just really ugly. It's kind of sad to see something just so ugly be in the finale of the game. And then the train is another moment where just the pre-rendered graphics just look kind of strange, and even the perspective looks weird. I can't tell where X is at on the train, and if X is 2D but this train is kind of 3D, it's kind of confusing and ugly. If X4 was just a random 2D action game that got made on the PlayStation 1, it might not be held to such a high level of scrutiny, but Mega Man 8 came out the same year, and in this era, Capcom was producing some of the all-time best sprite art with that previously mentioned Mega Man 8, the Breath of Fire games, and some of their fighting games. So X4 is definitely a visual downgrade from those games. It is a good looking game, but there are some really ugly moments that just kind of caught me off guard in the visual presentation. That being said, the game's not so in love with its graphics that they wind up getting in the way of the gameplay. The classic example would be in Mega Man 8, the level with the toys wind up being really confusing and not knowing what can hurt you and where you really are in the level at certain moments. X4 never does anything like that. Even when the graphics are kind of ugly, it's still clear about what can hurt you and where you can go. And so I would take this graphical presentation with a little bit of its muddy textures or stilted animation on pre-rendered stuff over a graphical presentation that hampered the gameplay. I want to mention the animated cutscenes briefly as well. Here, the animated cutscenes are again kind of tacky and, not as well produced as, a Studio Ghibli film or something like that, but they're not distractingly awful. In Mega Man 8, those cutscenes were distractingly bad, whereas in X4, they tell a story and they add to the gameplay, and yeah, they could use a little bit of improvement here and there, but I think overall the cutscenes in Mega Man X4 are a positive addition to the game. Now, you can't review any Mega Man game without discussing the music, and in X4 there's an interesting kind of stylistic shift in the music. The music is very somber and intense at moments and kind of dark. Particularly the level select screen is just this really intense rhythm and melody, making me feel like every situation and every decision I make is super intense and feeling the weight of the consequences of those decisions. There's not a lot of catchy poppy kind of songs. There's not really any like power rock stuff. It's much more moody, it's much more dark, and it's not a bad soundtrack, it's just not what I'm used to from Mega Man games, and ultimately it is a bit of a step down from some of the iconic music we've gotten in the Mega Man series, particularly X1, X2, X3, I felt all had awesome music, and X3 had a darker tone to the music but still had that rock and that kind of catchiness and fun to the music, whereas I wouldn't really describe any of the music I heard in X4 as particularly fun. It's not bad music, and it definitely fits the mood of the storyline, but again, in terms of just my enjoyment, the music is a bit of a downgrade from what came before. So now it's time to sum up my overall feelings about Mega Man X4. At the end of the day, I think Mega Man X4 is a great game. The X playthrough and the Zero playthrough are both unique and have a lot to offer in the gameplay department. The storyline is super dark and interesting and tragic, and I just really liked playing through it. The graphics, while not perfect, are a step up in a fun way and just add a unique visual flair to this game and make it stand out within the series. And so I just gotta say, Mega Man X4 is awesome. I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. What keeps it away from the 10 out of 10 is the lingering feelings of maybe the way that the exploration was taken out of the game design could have been handled better, and then a little bit of shortcomings here and there in terms of the presentation. The visuals just aren't quite as crisp as what Capcom was doing at this time, and the music, again, is, while fitting for the storyline and the vibe of the game, is a downgrade from what I like about Mega Man music. But overall, again, I will say this is a 9 out of 10. It is a classic game. If you like Mega Man games and have missed it up to this point, you gotta find it, you gotta play it. It's a good one. And even if you like 2D action platformers, I think you'll have a lot of fun with this one. So thank you so much for watching this review. I really appreciate you all watching. I know it's been a long time since my last review, so those of you who are back, thanks for coming back. And those of you who are new, thanks for checking out this review, and please check out my other ones. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree, how you feel about Mega Man X4, and hopefully I'll see you sooner rather than later with my next review. Have a nice day. Thanks.